actually, this brings us into another advancement that I wanted to talk about today, which is called antibody-drug conjugates, because this is yet a different type of therapy, but one that for ovarian cancer and other cancers, has really been shown to be quite effective, and is really, there's a lot. I just showed you 8 trials in this area for CAR T therapy. Well, there's 11 trials for antibody-drug conjugates. And it's something that I think we'll come back to over and over again, especially, as it is Pancreatic Cancer Awareness Month coming up. I could see doing a webinar specifically talking about new therapies and breakthroughs in pancreatic cancer, because, gosh, yes, it's certainly needed. And, we help quite a number of patients with pancreatic cancer find their way on to clinical trials and other innovative approaches. So, so I can tell you a little bit about the antibody-drug conjugate field and show you an example.
I know nothing about that.
Yeah. And most patients wouldn't. Most patients know chemotherapy. And what's interestingly is, we've talked about the immune system and how it can home into a tumor. We've talked about in previous webinars, chemotherapy, which is just small drugs that sort of float around the body and they get into cells and they cause those cells to stop dividing. Now, sometimes when it's the cancer, that could be quite beneficial. But when it's other cells, like your gut cells or maybe your bone marrow cells, which need to produce white blood cells, it's not so good. And so that's why patients will have neutropenia. They'll have low white blood cell counts while they're getting chemotherapy. So what if we could actually put those two together? And that's how antibody-drug conjugates were born. The antibody piece is produced by the immune system, and it is the sort of the action end of T cells and other B cells that go and home in on cancer and their proteins. So here is it's a antibody, which is a protein itself. So you don't need any cells for this. It's a purified protein produced in the lab that's going to be like a heat-seeking missile and find that protein on the tumor surface. Again, we know, most of the time if the protein is likely to be there, and we can find out specifically by testing the patient's tumor. This antibody isn't just alone, and there are drugs where the antibody is just a single antibody, things like Herceptin, which can be quite effective in HER2-positive breast cancer as an antibody. But in this case, antibody-drug conjugates, you're actually taking one of those chemotherapy drugs and one that's really, really potent. So you wouldn't want to just inject this without sort of an antibody to guide it. But what they're doing is they're attaching it with something called a chemical linker, which is just what it sounds like. It's a chemical bond between the chemotherapy, the drug, and that antibody. And then they're putting this into people, and the antibody goes and finds the tumor protein attaches, the chemotherapy then gets inside those cells, does its job, and effectively kills the cancer cells. It does still cause some side effects for the patient, but what we're seeing in the last year is about 8 of these have now been newly approved. For a while, we had seen 2 of them get approved, but it was a pretty long time to really start figuring out how to use these effectively to start treating patients. But the good news is now more and more of these are coming down the pike. And as I said, for this patient that we were looking at with ovarian cancer, we saw something like 11 of them right in her sort of geographical area. Again, when needed, they would be accessible for her. And unlike some of the fancier sort of, futuristic CAR T therapies, we have more data on these ADCs. So we already are starting to see that they're working for months, some of them 6 months, some of them 9 months or 12 months, some of them 3 months. So again, we can start to sort these out and say, okay, based on what your tumor has, the protein that it's having, and what we see in terms of the data, we might recommend your doctor consider sending you to, or you getting a second opinion at a specific cancer center that offers this therapy, and asking them, is it reasonable to consider? Is this good for you? And 90% of the time, the answer we're hearing is yes. And so, we do think that that's how we work, and that's how we get patients to get access to these therapies.
I see the excitement. I mean, chemo has kind of been understood that it kills cancer cells, but it kills regular cells and just hopefully kills more cancer cells than regular cells. And I think the idea of that being a more targeted, like using what it is good for in a targeted way, is just that's incredible.
Yeah.
Is that given? How is that generally given? Is that kind of like given like chemo, like you're going to show up every week for a period of time, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, it can vary based on how long it's expected to be around. The idea is that we're sort of, creating a system where the tumor is going to be, having drug around it as much as we can for as long as we can. That being said, these antibodies generally last in the body for about 3 weeks. And so it falls out to around an every 3-week repeated administration for these antibody-drug conjugates. Again, some of them are shorter if they last less long. Some of them could be longer. It could be a month or even 6 weeks. And generally somewhere in that sort of 2 to 6 week period is as frequently as they're given, but most of them we see are being given on an every 3 week schedule intravenously. So this is given through the vein, sort of system wide, and the protein itself is the heat seeking sort of pathway to finding the tumor.